In my list of 5 reasons for why there is sometimes resistance to debiasing, I didn't mention one of the most important factors because it really needs its own video. We're talking about what is known as bias or bias blind spot, and it's a real cognitive bias. It turns out that we're biased against the view that our own judgments are biased. The pioneer in this work is Emily Pronin, who is a Princeton psychologist who studies this phenomenon, whereby people believe they're less prone, less vulnerable to bias than other people. Like if you survey 1,000 people and ask them if they think they're more or less biased or just as biased as the average person, 800 to 900 of that 1,000 will say that they're less biased than the average person, which of course is statistically impossible. And maybe only 1 or 2 people in 1,000 will say they're more biased than the average person. There's been quite a lot of coverage of this phenomenon. This article from Carnegie Mellon University is just one example. It reports on studies of bias blind spot in physicians, whether they believe that their medical decisions about what drugs to prescribe for patients are influenced by the free gifts they receive from pharmaceutical companies who are lobbying for doctors to prescribe their drugs. Here are some interesting quotes. When physicians receive gifts from pharmaceutical companies, they may claim that their gifts do not affect their decisions about what medicine to prescribe because they have no memory of the gifts biasing their prescriptions. However, if you ask them whether a gift might unconsciously bias the decisions of other physicians, most will agree that other physicians are unconsciously biased by the gifts, while continuing to believe that their own decisions are not. This disparity is the bias blind spot, and occurs for everyone for many different types of judgments and decisions. Now, there are several reasons why we might be prone to this bias. One plausible reason is that we think we can detect the presence of bias in our thoughts just by introspecting them, mentally surveying our own beliefs. If we don't find any sign of bias, we conclude that it's not there. I mentioned this delusion earlier in the course when we were talking about how most of the cognitive factors responsible for our behavior are operating unconsciously in the background. So this kind of introspection isn't going to be a reliable source of information on our own biases, but it's a compelling belief. What's important is that we don't have the same kind of introspective access to other people's minds. I can only judge your actions based on your behavior and what you say. I can't see inside your head. This asymmetry in how we access our own thoughts versus how we infer the thoughts of others based on behavior is one of the reasons why we view ourselves as less prone to bias than others. So this bias blind spot can be a source of resistance to debiasing. This is why it's important to make people aware of it and to reiterate the central message, which is that everyone is equally vulnerable to cognitive biases. You need to convince people to assume that their own judgments are just as vulnerable to bias as everyone else's, and ignore, or at least critically manage, the strong intuition that they themselves are not biased. Again, not an easy thing to do. Some people are easier to convince of this than others. Hey, guess what? We've talked about resistance to debiasing. So now let's move on to actually talk about debiasing strategies that work. The video you just watched is part of a larger course on cognitive biases and critical thinking. You can find it on Udemy. Just click the link on the screen or in the video description to get a 50% discount on the sign up. Or you can find it and many other video courses over at the Critical Thinker Academy, where you can sign up for as low as $3 a month and get access to almost 20 hours of video training on a variety of topics related to logic, argumentation, and critical thinking.